Somewhere in America this week, a family is going to open a drawer and find a knife that belonged to a Vietnam veteran. Maybe it is sitting in a cigar box. Maybe it is in a toolbox out in the garage. Maybe it is still in its sheath, stiff and dark, smelling like old leather and old oil. And almost every family says the same sentence. This must have been his army knife. Here is the part that surprises people. There is a very good chance the army never gave him that knife at all. He may have bought it himself, out of his own pay, before he ever left the United States, or his wife bought it, or his father did, and mailed it halfway around the world. And once you understand why a young man would spend his own money on a knife when the government was already handing him equipment, something strange starts to happen. The scratches begin to matter. The initials begin to matter. Even the ugly homemade repair on the sheath begins to matter. Stay with me to the end of this, because before you clean that knife, there are a handful of things you need to photograph, and a handful of things you need to write down. Once those are gone, they are gone for good. Now let us clear something up right at the start, because there is a myth floating around that the American military sent men to Vietnam without decent cutting tools. That is not true. The Army had edged tools. Plenty of them. Start with the M7 bayonet. It came in around 1964, alongside the rifle it was built for, and it was intended to work as a bayonet, as a fighting knife, and as a utility tool. Something close to 3 million of them were produced across the whole run. Then there is the blade most people picture when they hear the words Vietnam survival knife, the pilot survival knife. The military specification behind that pattern goes back to 1953. By 1962, the blade had been shortened to 5 inches, so it would interfere less with a man in a cockpit. Camillus and Milpar turned them out through the Vietnam years. They went first to naval air crews, and then, one way or another, they turned up all across the services. Now here is the sentence I want you to carry through the rest of this video. Issued describes the supply system. It does not describe the man. A bayonet is optimized for one job. A pilot survival knife was designed around getting a man out of a wrecked aircraft alive. Both of them are very good at what they were built for. But a rifleman walking a paddy dike, a helicopter crew chief, a mechanic on a flight line, a medic, a supply sergeant, an advisor working alongside local troops, those men were not doing the same work. The equipment was standardized, the jobs never were. So what was actually missing? Not quality. That is the lazy answer, and it is usually unfair to the men who made government contract knives. Let me give you 4 gaps instead. Gap 1. Ordinary work. Most of what a knife does in a day has nothing whatsoever to do with a fight. Cutting cord, opening crates, cutting rations open, stripping wire, trimming a poncho liner, whittling a tent stake. A blade designed for one dramatic purpose is not automatically the best tool for 100 small ones. Gap 2. Size. One man wanted more blade in his hand. The next man wanted something that folded shut and rode flat on his belt without catching on every single thing he owned. Gap 3. Survival. An air crewman going down into the trees has a completely different list of problems than a clerk on a large, well-supplied installation. And gap 4 is the one I find most human. Confidence. A privately purchased knife was not automatically better. Sometimes it was simply his. He picked it out. He knew it. He trusted it. In a life where somebody else chose your rifle, your boots, your food, and your haircut, a knife was one of the very few things a young man could still choose for himself. Hold on to that, because it changes how you read every scratch on that blade later on. Now, the popular version of this story goes something like this. Soldier walks into a post exchange in Vietnam. Soldier buys a knife. End of story. The real evidence is messier than that. And messier is a great deal more interesting. Veterans do not all remember the same thing. Some recalled that buck folders were everywhere in the exchanges, easy to pick up in country, and that half the men around them carried one. But another veteran, who served in 1968 and 69, remembered it very differently. He said knives were rare in the exchanges he saw, that the shelves were full of radios and record players, and that his own buck folder had to be sent over from home. Both of those men can be telling the truth. A base in 1965 is not a base in 1970. A large support installation is not a fire base, and what one exchange had on the shelf that month tells you almost nothing about the next one. So instead of one pipeline, picture a network. An exchange in the States before he shipped out. An exchange overseas, when it had anything worth buying. A rod and gun club, a hometown hardware store, or sporting goods counter. A mail-order coupon in the back of a magazine. And a wife, a mother, or a father, buying the knife at home and putting it in a box. There was never one supply line for a privately purchased knife. There was a personal one, and it stretched all the way back to an American kitchen table. Which brings us to the name that comes up more than any other, Randall Made Knives, out of Orlando, Florida. The Model 14, the one they called the Attack, traces back to the middle of the 1950s. Bo Randall carried prototypes to Quantico in 1954. A small number were purchased for evaluation. The Marine Corps Equipment Board received examples. And then, as often happens, the project did not turn into mass production for the Corps. So the design simply went into the catalog instead. And then comes the part of this story that I find genuinely remarkable. In January of 1963, a captain named George Ingraham, serving with the 94th Medical Detachment in Vietnam, wrote a letter to Bo Randall, describing a problem he was looking at with his own eyes. He wanted teeth cut into the spine of the blade so a man could cut through the skin of a downed aircraft and get trapped people out. And he wanted a hollow handle so survival gear could ride inside the knife itself. That letter became the Model 18. The early ones capped that hollow handle with a rubber crutch tip. The grip was deliberately left bare, so the owner could wrap it himself with cord, or fishing line, or leather, or tape, whatever he had, and whatever he might need later. Some of those blades were made in Orlando. Some used Solingen steel. Now think about what actually happened there. A small shop in Florida took a letter from one officer in the field and turned it into a production knife. No procurement cycle, no committee, no specification revision working its way through a building. That is the insight worth keeping. A commercial maker could sometimes answer one man's specific problem faster than a system built to equip an entire army. And a Randall was not pocket change. When Bo Randall first wrote back about the new design, he mentioned a figure of $28.50. Ingram himself noted that interest was high among the pilots around him, but that men who were getting short on their tours did not want to spend that kind of money so late in the game. Sit with that for a second. The knife cost enough that a man had to decide it mattered. Now let me show you the opposite kind of knife entirely. In 1964, a small California company introduced a folding hunting knife with a lock strong enough that it could work like a fixed blade. Buck called it the Folding Hunter. The catalog called it the Model 110. By the company's own published history, they had real doubts about it. Full production did not begin until September of that year, which meant only a limited number were on the shelf for the biggest selling season of the year. The original price tag was $16. Within 6 months, it was the hottest new knife in the industry. Within 2 years, by their own account, it was the best-selling sport knife in the world. So here is the question worth asking. Why would a young man in a war zone buy a civilian hunting knife? Because almost everything he did with a knife was not fighting. It was cutting, prying, opening, repairing, eating. It was ordinary work, done every single day, in weather that ruined anything left exposed. A locking folder closed up on itself. It rode on a belt without a long blade swinging off his hip. It did not look like a weapon, and most days it did not need to. And that is the bigger idea I want to leave with you. Vietnam did not turn every privately purchased knife into a fighting knife. Sometimes the war simply revealed how useful a good civilian knife had already been all along. Collector accounts also mention buck-fixed blades in service. The 119 and the 120 come up often. But be careful with the word most. Recollection is not a survey. Now the blade that looked like what people expected a combat knife to look like. The Gerber Mark II. It was designed by a retired Army captain named Clarence Holzman, a man who had served with the 101st Airborne in the Second World War. Accounts say he based the blade profile on a Roman short sword. Gerber accepted the design in 1966. A quick note on dates, because the sources genuinely disagree. Some say commercial production began in late 1966, others date the production run from 1967. I am telling you both, rather than pretending the record is tidy. It was a double-edged dagger, with a wasted blade and a handle shaped for a fencing-style grip. Purpose-built. It looked serious, because it was serious. But here is the twist that makes it useful to us. The Mark II was optimized for one extreme function, and a blade optimized for one extreme function is often mediocre at the ordinary chores a man performs 100 times a week. There is also a strange chapter here, in the 1970s. The exchange system stopped carrying the knife. The reasoning, as it has been reported, was that it was in poor taste, too brutal. So Gerber's designer, Al Marr, added sawtooth serrations near the guard, and the knife was repositioned and sold as a survival aid. Think about what that means. The definition of what a military knife was supposed to be was changing while the war was still going on. Same steel, same shape, different story on the box. Which brings me to a warning. Western Cutlery of Boulder, Colorado, made large Bowie-style knives all through this period. The big one, the W49, turns up constantly in Vietnam conversations, and it was advertised in the company's catalogs of the era. But notice what I did not just say. I did not say it was issued, and I did not say that any particular one of them went to Vietnam. Here is the collector rule I would like to leave you with today. Vietnam-era manufacture is not the same thing as Vietnam service. Western sold to civilians. Buck sold to civilians. Randall sold to hunters and collectors as well as to soldiers. Gerber sold commercially. A date code proves when a knife was made. It does not prove where it went. And one important exception, so I am not overstating my own point. Some specialized knives genuinely were procured and issued. The recon knives associated with MACFES, OG, were developed through the Counterinsurgency Support Office on Okinawa, under a man named Conrad Baker, ordered in limited batches from overseas contractors, and put into the hands of specific units. So there are 3 categories here, not 2. Standard issue, specialized procurement, and private purchase. Most family knives fall into that third one. Now let us turn the knife over and look at what the man himself did to it. Look for initials scratched into a bolster or a guard, a name or a service number cut into the sheath, a unit, a date, cord or friction tape wrapped around a grip, a replaced snap, a repaired strap, a blade sharpened so many times that the shape of it has changed. And now the discipline part. Do not turn every scratch into a war story. A modification tells you about ownership. It does not automatically tell you about combat. A homemade repair tells you the knife was used long and hard, which is its own kind of testimony. An engraved name may connect the object to a service record that can actually be researched, and an ugly, altered sheath may carry more real information than the polished blade sitting right next to it. Collectors tend to look at the blade first. Families should look at everything around it. When a man came home, the knife rarely came home alone. It came back with a duffel bag, with uniforms and patches, with photographs, orders, letters, a sharpening stone, sometimes a receipt still folded in a pocket. And then 40 or 50 years go by. The knife goes into a toolbox because it is useful. The photographs go into an album. The papers go into a drawer in another room, in another house. The sheath dries out, splits, and somebody decides it is not worth keeping. Nothing was destroyed. Everything was scattered. And that is the thing I most want you to hear today. The greatest threat to a Vietnam knife's history is not rust. It is separation. Rust you can slow down with dry air and a stable room. A story, once it has been split up between 3 households and 2 generations, usually does not come back. So, before you clean anything, do these 6 things. They cost nothing. 1. Photograph it exactly as it is. Both sides of the blade, the ricasso, and any stamps you can find. The guard, the pommel, the handle, the sheath, front and back, any damage. Photograph it dirty. You can never get that back. 2. Photograph it beside anything that came with it. Papers, photos, the stone, the original box. You do not have to attach them to each other. Just record that they belong together. 3. Write the provenance down today. His name, his branch, his unit if you know it, his years of service. Who told you the knife was his? Who has had it since? Sign that page and date it. That page is now part of the object. 4. Do not scrub the markings off trying to make it look new. Wear and patina carry information. 5. Do not throw away the ugly sheath. On a historic knife, the sheath very often carries the maker marks, the unit marks, and the man's own handwriting. 6. Keep the package together. Knife, sheath, stone, papers, photograph, and your written note. 1 box. On storage, I will point you toward people who do this professionally. The National Park Service publishes free guidance on the curatorial care of metal objects, including keeping relative humidity low and keeping metal out of damp basements and hot attics. The Library of Congress publishes free guidance on handling and storing family photographs and documents. Both are linked in the description below. I also put every one of these steps into a free printable checklist. It is in the description. It costs nothing. Fill it out at the kitchen table with the knife sitting in front of you. Because the easiest time to save a knife's story is before the paperwork and the memories drift apart. So let us come back to where we started. The government's records can tell you a great deal. They can tell you what a man was issued, which unit carried him, where he served and when. But an issued item tells you what the army believed a soldier needed. A knife he bought with his own money tells you something else entirely. A Randall might tell you he was preparing for the very worst day. A buck folder might tell you he was thinking about Tuesday. A Gerber might tell you he wanted one specific tool for one specific job. And a plain, unmarked blade in a toolbox might tell you nothing at all, unless somebody in the family writes down what they remember. That is the part no auction house and no archive can do for you. The Army's records can tell you what a man was issued. Sometimes the knife his family still owns tells you what he actually chose. And if you have documentation that corrects anything I said today, bring it. Put it in the comments. I will read it. That is how this gets better.